In previous videos in this series, we learned of the 5 criteria that a zoning hearing board will use when deciding whether to grant or to deny a variance. These criteria can be found in the MPC or the Municipality Planning Code, or on the website of your town zoning office. In this video, we will look closely at Criterion 2. And as before, we will use the zoning ordinance from the town of Bloomsburg in Pennsylvania. If you do find that these things differ slightly in your own city or town, they won't differ that much, so we can use this as our example. Now, the second criterion is located at section 27-1003.c.2 of the zoning ordinance. Now, we looked closely at Criterion 1 in our last video, where we noted that the landowner must show dimensional irregularities of the property that prevent it from conforming with the ordinance. Criterion 2 seems to take over from here, where the landowner now must show that because of such physical circumstances or conditions, there is no possibility that the property can be developed in strict conformity with the provisions of this chapter, and that the authorization of a variance is therefore necessary to enable the reasonable use of the property. Although it's not clear what reasonable use means here, it very likely is a use that we would find either in the permitted use section or in the special exception use section. Here's an example. Let's start with an overhead drawing of some section of Market Street. Our example will focus on the property located at 1221 Market Street. Let's say that this is located in one of the residential districts in the city. The houses we see here are all built in the 1950s. And although the garages are detached and they're located in the rear of the property, you can see that some driveways have been put in right off of Market Street. These are all modifications, perhaps, introduced later in the house's history. And if you look at 1221, that property is relatively much more narrow than the other properties around it. And in fact, with respect to the zoning ordinance, 1221 is a non-conforming property. Now, there's a reason why the house there at 1221 is marked with a dashed line. It no longer exists. It was destroyed in a fire a few years back. Now, the Perez family wants to buy the 1221 property, but before they buy the property, they want to make sure they could rebuild the house. The realtor having shown them a letter from the zoning office which said that because the landowners had failed to meet certain time constraints, they could not rebuild the house. To rebuild the house, they would need variances granted by the zoning hearing board. They in fact want to rebuild the house on the exact footprint of the original house, marked here by the dashed lines. But as noted a moment ago, this property is narrow, so narrow in fact that it is a non-conforming property. And this creates a bit of a problem for the proposal. For if the house was rebuilt on its original footprint, it would violate the side yard setback. Now, since the house was built in the 1950s, long before the enacting of the zoning ordinance, the house was fine before the ordinance was enacted, but now that it's been enacted, it's a non-conforming property. It's too narrow for the district, and the side yard setbacks are violated. But we know that the town council would have instructed the zoning office to then register this property as a non-conforming property within the district, and then everything would be fine. Now, the problem is that there's no more house there. It needs to be rebuilt, and so whatever the new owner would be doing, they would be violating the side yard setback. There is the further complication that with respect to non-conforming properties, there are additional laws that regulate them, where in cases like this, like a fire, the property would lose its non-conforming status if the landowner doesn't rebuild the structure within a certain amount of time. In Bloomsburg, that would be a year. So if a house is destroyed by fire and it's a non-conforming property, the landowners have a year to begin reconstruction of that house. And if they fail to do that, then the property loses its non-conforming status. And any structure built on that subsequently must conform to the standards of the district. Well, this is a non-conforming property. The house was destroyed by fire. It's been 2 years since that fire, and yet no reconstruction has started. So legally, this property now has lost its non-conforming status. And so any new house built on the property must now conform to district regulations. The Perez's would be prohibited from rebuilding a house on the footprint of the old house. And any house they could build that would actually meet the regulations would be just ridiculously narrow and too small to even live in. And this is a residential district which prohibits all other sorts of things like businesses or anything like that. Residential use is the only use But without any variances, they can't build a house that would be livable. They can't use the property as a residence. And although this is a complex case, what is clear is that the real problem stems from the narrowness of the property. Establishing this irregularity by way of fact would meet Criterion 1, and showing that this irregularity runs up against the ordinance and hence won't allow the Perez's to build the house, and the only use in this district that's permitted is residential, and what is reasonable use is what's permitted, then the Perez's, if not granted a variance, would not be able to use this property in a reasonable way. The Perez's then have met Criterion 2. That is, a landowner meets Criterion 2 when they can show that without a variance, dimensional irregularities would prevent them from using the property in a reasonable way. So there you have it, our close look at Criterion 2.